Before we begin, I want to clarify that this is all just my opinion, because I know people get really riled up about their favorite movies. And I do too, which is why I'm making this video. Also, spoilers for every movie I mention here. So to explain why The Prestige is Christopher Nolan's greatest film, first I have to explain why I personally don't think it's some of his other films, namely Memento and The Dark Knight. I'm not at all disputing that these are great films, but what I am disputing is the extent of their greatness. So we all know Christopher Nolan has trouble with women in his films. I'm not going to pretend it's not a problem in its own right when the wives and love interests in his movies die over and over again only to add depth to the leading man, but I think it's also indicative of a larger problem in his work, which is that he doesn't tend to write characters as people, but as symbols, pawns, and plot devices. This might just be a me thing because I like character-driven films, but it bothers me that in Memento, Nolan removes any potential for the film to be character-driven. Leonard's character is about survival, whether that means literally surviving or surviving his trauma, but his identity is necessarily removed.
Do I lie to myself to be happy? In your case, Teddy, yes, I will.
And in the end, nobody is what they say they are, including Leonard. Cool twist, crazy theme, definitely a mind bender, but the twist ending of Memento isn't really something you're led to be able to figure out. Which is sort of frustrating given how closely related Nolan's films are to the neo-noir genre, especially his early work. With neo-noir being closely related to the detective genre, I want to cite film critic Roger Caillois, who, in his essay The Detective Novel is Game, said that the pleasure one gets from a detective novel is not that of listening to a story, but rather that of watching a magic trick which the magician immediately explains. The author has set everything up in advance. The story opens on a rigged set. We do not even see the main event, but only its disturbing consequences. Then, without delay, the detective comes on the scene and discovers, bit by bit, a pigeon feather in the magician's pocket, the deftly concealed mirrors, the false bottom in the trunk, the wire that held the egg to the hat's lining. He unmasks the imposter. He shows that nothing happened the way we thought, that the murder was not committed where they said it was, nor at the time they stated. He proves that we have been tricked about the time and the place, and after giving the real answers to the questions when and where, he explains the unlikely how. Well, in Memento, we open with the disturbing consequences, check. The imposter, or at least the fact that there is one, is unmasked in the end, check. We realize, arguably, that we have been tricked at least by someone, check. But everything is not set up in advance. Thematically, since we're dealing with such an unreliable narrator, it makes sense that we would have this specific betrayal of expectations, but it really does feel like that, a betrayal. Because there's nothing tangible in the film to hint that Leonard has lied to himself. It's basically an it was all a dream ending. We can't guess the ending by paying close attention, or at least there's no real reason for us to be able to. This is in stark contrast to The Prestige, where every truth is foreshadowed.
I'm sorry, I just don't know.
It has no truth.
We should have told Fallon.
No one cares about the man who disappears, the man who goes into the box. They care about the one who comes out the other side.
It's as bad as the day it happened.
The Prestige explicitly informs us at the start of the film that we should watch closely.
Are you watching closely?
It just obscures its truth adeptly enough towards the start and makes its disturbing consequences feel motivated enough without even more extraordinary circumstances. When the truth is finally explicitly revealed, when we discover that Borden is using a double, his twin,
I used a double.
and Angier is cloning himself, it's difficult to feel cheated, and in fact these are probably the most simple assumptions we could have made.
Simple maybe, but not easy.
Everything has been set up in advance. This is perfectly illustrated in the scene between Borden and Sarah, where Borden is showing Sarah the bullet trick. First of all, it's interesting to note that this isn't the Borden twin who loves Sarah in this scene. He was dressed as Fallon and just left. It's the other twin, the one who's more concerned with magic, who at other points in the film seems genuinely disdainful towards Sarah.
Tell me how you do it.
No, I can't do that.
Well, then you can't do it. Alfred.
I can't do it.
I'm sorry, Alfred, but I can't raise a child on my own.
You don't tell anybody that, I told you.
Okay.
Gunpowder. Wadding. And a bullet. Ramrod. Hold out your hand. The bullet is not even in the gun when the charge is fired.
Once you know, it's actually very obvious.
For just a moment, she's this Borden's equal. She's along for the ride with him, even if he's not thrilled to have given up his secret, and though she is happy to be assured of her husband's safety, she really does take joy in understanding the mechanics of the trick. Particularly poignant when you realize the sheer extent of how much she is being tricked. In The Prestige as a whole, once you know what's really going on...
It's actually very obvious.
So, The Dark Knight. The Dark Knight is obviously a cultural milestone. It paved the way tonally for the Marvel Cinematic Universe to revolutionize the superhero genre by saying, we can take superhero movies seriously. We can use them to say what we value. And while there's been plenty of controversy over the political messages of the Dark Knight trilogy, Dark Knight Rises in particular, which feels very anti-Occupy Wall Street, but it also pissed off Rush Limbaugh, so I think what that really speaks to is Nolan's messy use of political imagery. It does seem like the main message of The Dark Knight, at least, is that people kind of inherently value community and really are willing to be good to each other.
This city just showed you that it's full of people ready to believe in good.
Which is a wonderful message, and it's a really good movie, but it does kind of suffer from this characters as symbols thing that's so prevalent in Nolan's films.
There's a symbol that can be incorruptible.
While again, The Dark Knight is a much less egregious example than The Dark Knight Rises, it's still present. The Dark Knight trilogy was in a complicated position on our cultural timeline. Before this, the Batman franchise was just full camp, full irony, not even a note of sincerity. Michael Keaton was, I guess, the closest thing we had to a sincere Batman, but Tim Burton's Batman still wasn't a sincere movie. Still, Batman was such a cultural symbol already before the Dark Knight trilogy that in our cultural consciousness it would have been hard for us to picture him as anything else. Batman is the masked vigilante that represents goodness and justice. It's just that in every Batman film leading up to the Dark Knight trilogy, that innate connotation of goodness and justice was satirized, where in the Dark Knight it's played straight. So Nolan was already beginning to do something drastically different from the superhero movie zeitgeist when he made Batman Begins. Nobody even likes Batman Begins. What he didn't change, true to form, was that character of Batman/Bruce Wayne being a symbol, and if anything, he leaned even harder into it. Because again, Nolan has a record of writing almost all his characters as plot devices, pawns, and symbols, rather than real people. Christian Bale's Bruce Wayne has a lot less wisecracking, though there still is some, a lot of self-seriousness, and just kind of this face in just about every situation. I think the standout role of The Dark Knight by far is Heath Ledger's Joker. You could argue that he's a symbol of the apathetic postmodern hellscape that the franchise was trying to break out of, which basically means he's a symbol of not giving a darn about anything, which basically means he can just go balls to the wall with the character, which he did. Christian Bale, though, who usually does go balls to the wall with his characters, kind of ended up stuck within the confines of Bruce as a symbol, so he couldn't do that this time around. The one thing he did get to do was the voice. Everyone hates the voice! I love the voice! While I like that we're taking goodness and justice seriously, even with some irresponsible political connotations, the voice is the one fun aspect of silly campiness that we really get to keep. And while I like Christian Bale's Bruce Wayne, even in spite of all this, even he agrees that Heath's Joker stuck out a lot more than his Batman. Now you might be saying, oh Charlotte, you just don't appreciate Christian Bale. Nope! Wrong! I love Christian Bale. He's my favorite actor. I think he's an absolute genius, which is why my favorite Christopher Nolan movie is the one that doesn't underutilize him. The Prestige let Christian Bale work his magic. I think Christian Bale and Christopher Nolan working together is kind of like an unstoppable force meets an immovable object.
An unstoppable force meets an immovable object.
An actor known for his incredible ability to transform himself and take on a life meets a director known for his tendency to simulate things, including simply simulating life. Because his characters are just symbols! I think the Dark Knight trilogy is a meeting of these two minds that, for me, kind of leaves something to be desired. But the Prestige works incredibly well, mainly because the characters of Borden manages to be so true both to the work of Christopher Nolan and Christian Bale. In both Borden and Bale, we see a man who clearly enjoys challenging himself and has proven willing to put himself in the way of physical harm for his art, whether that means cutting off his hand for a trick or losing 62 pounds for a role. In film critic Max O'Connell's article, Obsession in the Void, The Performances of Christian Bale, he suggests that perhaps Bale found something moving in the idea of men who find purpose in deceiving viewers in order to entertain them, and in the idea of men who are madly committed to realizing an idealized form of craft at the expense of their personal identities. Nolan says in an IGN interview that Bale expressed interest in the role before Nolan even considered reaching out to him, but now it's hard to imagine anyone else as well suited to play Borden. Now, Nolan's films are usually speculative or science fiction, driven by what-if questions. In other words, they're simulation-based. This is clearly the kind of work he's fascinated by, and where his talent shines through the most. Speculative fiction with a shocking twist. And The Prestige, obviously, is a beautiful instance of that. His best, in my opinion. But not only does it emphasize his strengths in that way, it also self-reflexively comments on Nolan's love for analog film and practical effects. Because in both Borden and Nolan, we see someone who does things the way that's, well, the simplest, but not the easiest. Someone who does things kind of the old-fashioned way and doesn't want to rely too heavily on novelties. In a Playboy interview for Dunkirk, over 10 years after The Prestige was made, he says, "At the time you were fine watching visual effects from 10 years ago, but they don't hold up now. What's the difference? Our perception, to a certain extent, because we have an eye that develops over time. So whenever engineers turn around and say, 'We've solved it, we've made video look like film,' I say, well, you've done a good trick. For now." But the characters in The Prestige, like Borden, are so strong because Nolan himself doesn't really do much with them. I've mentioned how unparalleled Christian Bale's character work is, and as Borden, he doesn't disappoint. Christopher Nolan's brother Jonathan Nolan co-wrote the script for The Prestige with him, and based on his work, Jonathan seems to lean more towards writing in general. Chris actually said in a 2017 interview with Playboy South Africa that he never wanted to be a writer, and only started writing because he needed to have the material to be a filmmaker. And then The Prestige of the film is based on The Prestige of the book by Christopher Priest, so Chris doesn't have to invent any new characters or adapt them all on his own. Bale, Jonathan, and Christopher Priest carry the character work, so Nolan is left to do what he does best: mess with the plot, play tricks on us, ask weird, fascinating questions, and give us weird, fascinating answers. And of course, emphasize the staying power that he attributes to analog film and practical effects. The Prestige ends up exemplifying all his strengths, while his weaknesses are largely diminished. There are plenty of other reasons why I find The Prestige brilliant. I haven't really mentioned Hugh Jackman yet, mainly because Nolan and Bale had already cemented their reputations a lot more than he had, but this really did turn out to be a career-defining role for him too. Mr. Greatest Showman. Mr. Hugh Pizzazz Boy Jackman. That's what they call him.
Yeah, I suppose, well, my characters are more of a natural, I suppose, showman. Fair to say. I think fair to say, not as good a magician.
Right, I've got the magic down,
Yeah.
but I've got no idea
To do on stage.
how to communicate
Yeah.
what I'm doing. And you are a brilliant showman
With average.
who absolutely can bring people in, draw them in,
Yeah.
and you can do that yourself. I mean, that was the truth, and that is the difference between the two of us.
And there's that. Not to mention, The Prestige is entertaining. It's fun to watch. While I feel that some of Nolan's other films can get bogged down by their own convolution, The Prestige actually benefits from it. Mainly because the premise, while never quite reaching the level of ridiculous, borders on it sometimes. Borden kills Angier's wife, so that's legit. Dead wife? In my Christopher Nolan movie? It's more likely than you think. But it just spirals so hard from there and becomes so fully about their egos that it's almost funny at points, without diminishing the stakes, of course. It's like, oh, what shenanigans will our wacky magician boys partake in next? It's like Tom and Jerry. At points, you kinda wanna shout, "It's just magic tricks, you dweebs!" But of course, it's not wholly unrealistic or unearned. There's absolutely emotional payoff in the end for their constant competition and struggle. Magic-obsessed meanie Borden meets his unkind fate. And nice Borden and Angier have some words, while Angier dies.
But if you could fool them, even for a second, then you could make them wonder. And then you got to see something very special. You really don't know. It was the look on their faces.
There's more emotional weight right there than every other Christopher Nolan film combined! Okay, maybe not Interstellar. Obviously, I cried at Interstellar. What magnificent, tragic endings for poor Angier and mean Borden, done in by their own hubris. And what a bittersweet ending for nicer Borden, able to return to his beloved daughter but only having lost his wife and brother along the way. Another dead wife? In my Christopher Nolan movie? It's more likely than you think. And what a beautiful examination of the nature of performance and competition. Who are we keeping up the illusion for? Who are we trying to impress? To beat? Is it for our peers? The public? Ourselves? Does it lead to our downfall, or is it raw, noble human aspiration? Can it be both? Speaking of performance, I think Nolan's casting of David Bowie as Nikola Tesla is not only legendary, but his reasons for doing it are spot on, too. In the same IGN interview, he says that he needed someone with an extraordinarily charismatic and noticeable presence, but who wasn't a movie star, someone with a different kind of charisma and cult following. A lot like Tesla himself has become in the digital age. Basically, in my opinion, the whole film is perfectly casted, brilliantly self-reflexive, and actually entertaining. I'm not saying The Prestige is a perfect movie. It does fall into some of the typical traps that Nolan films tend to fall into. While I do think the complex plot is largely to its benefit, I'll admit there are moments where it gets in the way. Like, I still don't totally get this line.
It took courage to climb into that machine every night, not knowing if I'd be the man in the box. Or in The Prestige.
He'll always always literally be the one in the Prestige first and then going into the box at the next show, because that's how the trick works. I don't know. And his treatment of female characters is still kind of abysmal, although I think Sarah is treated with a little more empathy than most of his women, even though she kills herself. And Olivia doesn't even die, and she isn't even totally portrayed as an evil Jezebel seductress, and she even seemed kind of sad about Sarah's death, even though we never saw them speak to each other. It's a low friggin' bar. But I think if you want to get an idea of where Christopher Nolan's brilliance really lies, and Christian Bale's and Hugh Jackman's for that matter, The Prestige is a solid bet. If you made it all the way through this, thank you. And if you enjoyed that video, I'd love it if you drop a like and subscribe, and I hope to keep making similar content, and I'd love to have a small audience to make that content for. Anyway, thank you for watching. Have a lovely day. Bye. Real reason The Prestige is the best Nolan film? There's 2 Christian Bales.